Hello, this is the third video about how to make this villainous sequin jacket out of a McCalls 6818 pattern. All of my pieces are cut, and now I'm going to put together the bodice. I have the bodice pieces laid out, and I'm going to use wonder clips to pin them together at the princess seams, matching the notches. When I sew, I'm going to go in the direction of the sequins. The fabric wants to stretch, so I'm trying to feed it evenly and keep the sequins stacked smoothly. Some people remove the sequins from the seam allowance, which I would do if this was going to be a nice gown, but for this project I don't think it's worth the amount of time that would take. Once the seams are sewn, I'm loosely hand sewing the seam allowance toward the sides to keep it from sticking out. I'm staying about 1 inch away from the ends of the seams. After the princess seams, I can sew the side seams together and hand sew them toward the back. And then the center back can go either direction. The shoulder seams will have a lot of sequins piled up, so I'm trimming them out of the seam allowance and even cutting away the ones that are sewn in place. Now I can pin the shoulder seams together, matching the princess seams, and sew. Then hand sew the seam allowance toward the back. I'm going to use a separating zipper at the front, so I'll go ahead and resize it now. I'm marking the finished length it needs to be based on the front pattern. Then I use a multi-tool to remove the zipper stops. I use scissors and a precision blade to cut off the extra length and a lighter to melt the raw edge of the zipper tape. Then a pair of dikes to cut away the teeth. I'm removing a few teeth below the finished length mark so there's room to put the zipper stops back on. I want to put some studs on the collar, lapel, and epaulettes before they're finished so the backs of the studs are hidden. I laid the studs out in a pattern I liked and started applying them, but I pretty quickly hated the look of it, so I stopped and cut a new lapel piece. This time I'll do a little planning instead of just winging it. I mark the seam allowance on the pattern piece and lay out the studs in a new pattern. The pyramid studs weren't working with the curve of the lapel. They always look crooked and weird, so I'm going to use dome studs now. I measure where they're laid out, about 1/2 inch from the edge on center and about 3/4 inch apart on center. So I marked that on my pattern and drilled the holes. Now I can use a water-soluble pencil or even a silver Sharpie to transfer the marks to my fabric piece. I put the pattern piece on a rubber mat and center a stud over one of the marks. I press it into the fabric so the prongs leave indentations. Now I can take a precision blade and stab through the fabric into the rubber mat to make a small slit for the prong to slide into. I use a scrap piece of fabric to protect the stud and fabric from the teeth of the multi-tool that I'm using to fold the prongs down. I press the prongs into the stud a little bit, but not completely. If they're not flat enough, they'll be pokey, and if they're pushed in too much, they'll distort the fabric. So there's a happy medium I'm trying to get on each one. I'm marking the seam allowance on the unstudded fake leather pieces, and then pinning them to their studded sides. Then sew the seams. I cut away the extra fabric at the points and snip the seam allowance at the curve of the collar. Then I flipped them out, being careful of the studs, and used a point turner to press the points out as much as possible without poking a hole. I'm using a Teflon foot to understitch the seam allowance. This will leave me with unstitched points at the collar, but I'm okay with that. I tried top stitching on a little mock-up and it looked too weird. Now, instead of basting the raw edges flat, I'm folding the lapels over to mimic the way they'll sit on the finished jacket. For the front and back to fold smoothly over each other, the front needs more fabric. See how big of a gap there is between the two layers? That's called turn of the cloth. If I baste the lapel edges together evenly, the back is going to bunch up when it's turned back. So I'm basting with almost a 1/4 inch difference because this fake leather is kind of thick. Now I can pin the collar and lapels to the bodice and sew them in place. Then I folded the tops of the zipper at an angle and pinned them about 1/4 inch away from the center front edge. This way I can sew the 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I'll still have a little bit of zipper tape exposed for the zipper head to clear any sequins. I'm cutting away the sequins that are sewn down facing into the zipper tape, and all the way around the lapels and collar. This way the lapels can fold back without the sequins getting in the way. I'll go ahead and sew the little tabs at the front now too. Now I can pin the lining all around, matching seams and notches. I'm starting sewing with the zipper foot to sew just 1 inch or so at the corner around the ends of the zipper. Then I switch back to a regular foot and sew the rest of the way around the center front and the neck. I snip around the curve and corners and then understitch the lining as far as I can get into the corners. Before I forget, I'm going to sew the epaulette at the shoulder edge. Now I want to sew the sleeve inseams. Since this is a long seam, I'm going to give it a second stitch to really keep it from stretching. Then I hand sew the seam allowance toward the back like I did for the bodice pieces. I'm pinning the sleeve into the bodice. I didn't bother ease stitching the sleeve cap because the sequins and mesh are so easy to ease without it. I'm sewing from the sleeve side, usually I sew on the bodice side, but this way I can ease the sequins in there better. And I'm doing a second stitch on this seam too. The shoulder pads have a notch in the felt. I'm marking that, then folding the shoulder pad in half and marking the fold. This is where I'll line the shoulder seam up to. I'm loosely hand sewing the shoulder pad just through the outer fabric into the shoulder seam allowance. Then I flip the garment and smooth the front over the shoulder pad. From inside the garment, I'm holding where the shoulder pad and arm's eye seam meet. Then I flip it back inside out and loosely tack the edges to the seam. Same thing for the back, and then repeat again for the other shoulder. Now I'm going to attach the sleeve lining a bit differently. I'm doing it the way a proper jacket would be made. First, I'm tacking the lining down at the neck to keep the seams and edge of the shoulder pad where they're supposed to be. Then I'm pinning the lining around the arm's eye. Now I can hand sew the lining around the arm's eye within the 1/2 inch seam allowance. I don't want to sew all the way through the shoulder pad, just through that outer layer of fabric. My sleeve linings are already sewn from the fit sample earlier, but I do need to redo the ease stitching. And this time I'll go ahead and ease stitch the second line of stitches too. Pull the outer ease stitch threads first and ease it to about the same size as the inner stitch. Then pull both threads and ease both lines of stitches at the same time to keep them even. This keeps that curved seam allowance a little tidier. I'm pinning the sleeve lining into the arm's eye at a few places so I can try it on and see how everything fits. I know the sequin fabric has been stretching, so I pin the sequin and the lining fabrics together at the wrist. It's a 1/2 inch to a full inch difference, so I'm going to cut the sleeves down just a 1/2 inch because I do want the lining to be slightly shorter than the sequin fabric so it doesn't show at the sleeve edge. I'm sewing them together and then understitching the lining to the seam allowance. Now I can run the lining back up the sleeve and pin around the opening. I'm matching seams and notches as I go. Then I hand sew the sleeve lining to the bodice lining. I'm making little stitches just through the lining. To end the stitch, I put the needle through a small area that's hidden in the seam. Wrap the thread around the needle 3 times and then pull the needle through to form a knot. I use my thumbnail to tighten the knot. I usually do this twice. Then I put the needle through the lining and snip to hide the thread tail. This jacket is already looking pretty cool. I'll show you how to do the skirt and finish it in the next video.